first I want to get your take on like what makes becoming coachable non-obvious.
Go ahead.
Oh, man. I think, the part of coaching that is obvious to people is I need a good coach. The part that is not obvious is I need to be coachable. It's that other half that of the engagement, as we talked about.
What makes someone remarkable? Is the college application process fair? Do you mind being described as the white people whisperer? What is the optimal age to get married?
You start to find the non-obvious way kind of works.
Is there like a cartoonist community?
That year was the first year that we ever heard a teacher talk about race.
So many times when we go live with these things, it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom.
Boom.
Welcome to the Non-Obvious Book Review. I have with me two of the three authors of a brand new book called Becoming Coachable. It is a fantastic resource and actually a topic that surprisingly has not really been covered quite that much. And we're going to talk a lot about that. But first of all, I want to say welcome to my two guests, Jacquelyn and Scott Osman. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. We're so excited to be here.
Yeah, so great to be here, Rohit.
Thank you. Me too. I'm excited about this topic because, coaching is a huge topic and there's lots of books written about being a coach. But this book is sort of the opposite angle. This book is what it takes to be coachable. And my first thought when I was reading it was anyone who's done any coaching must be wishing every client that they have read this book. So was that the motivation? Like, were you looking at the world of coaching and saying, we need to write the book that we wish our clients read before they worked with us?
That was definitely some of the inspiration for the book. It's such a funny thing. We talk so much about great coaches, and there are lots of movies and even TV shows about the power of a great coach. But there's another side of the equation that's sometimes overlooked or forgotten, and that's what it means to be coachable, to be able to take that coaching and best apply it so that we can continue to learn and grow.
Yeah, I think the book also came a little bit from my own experience because I had never had a coach. I didn't know anything about coaching even 10 years ago. And all of a sudden, over the last, I met Marshall 8 years ago, and then I was together, immersed in this world of coaching. And I met all these great coaches and thought, it'd be interesting to interact with them. But it probably took me 6 years before I became coachable and really understood what it meant, not just to have a coach, but to be able to really get the benefit of having a coach. And then we looked around in the marketplace, and sure enough, there was no book.
It's really interesting that you say it took you 6 years to become coachable. It strikes me that a lot of people, if you asked them, particularly leaders, are you coachable? I think people would overestimate their coachableness, if that's a word. Is that true? Did you find that?
Yeah, I think, talk about non-obvious. A lot of people think they're coachable. And yet don't even think about what it means to be coachable, right? And until you actually sort of crack that open and say, what does it take to be coachable? Like, how do you even know, right? So, I think people think, well, I'm sure I'm coachable because, I don't know, I'll listen to people and do whatever they think it is. But it's not that simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Another funny thing about it is really coachability is one of those factors that someone else needs to tell you that you're coachable. In the same way that people who say, I'm so self-aware, may not be very self-aware.
Yeah.
Because really part of being self-aware is taking the feedback and from other people and understanding how you're perceived in the world. And that's actually very similar for coachability.
Yeah. Well, you do actually start the book with this question of what does it mean to be coachable? And I have to assume it means more than just listening skills, right?
Yeah, we break down in the second chapter of the book, we break down what it takes to become coachable into what we call the openness framework, or the 4 keys to becoming coachable. And I have to say, obviously we've been working on this for a while, so it sounds obvious to us. And it's a little bit like that thing Marshall always says, which is, very often the most profound wisdom that you get is simple in hindsight, but you didn't think of it in advance.
Yeah.
And so, for example, one of the first keys to becoming coachable is to being open to change, right? Which that's kind of obvious in hindsight, and yet so many people go into coaching not open to like make the changes that they need to make to become a better leader.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting early on in the book is that you talked a little bit about misconceptions of coaching. And it sort of struck me as that would be really important to share with people if they weren't necessarily the ones seeking out the coach. Like the board said, we're going to get you a coach, or like someone else says, we're going to get you a coach. And there's a little bit of resistance that some people have to that because of some of these misconceptions. So can you share some of those misconceptions that people have about business coaching or executive coaching?
Absolutely. I think the two that I hear most frequently are coaching is a little bit like therapy, and it is distinctly different from therapy. It is very focused on business and results and leadership. Although there is some, of course, vulnerability and deep inner work that happens in the course of coaching engagement, but it is very distinctly different. And so I think it's important for people to understand that distinction. But the next one that we hear a lot is that the coach is there to fix you, right? And one of the examples we use in the book is that coaching is not surgery. It's actually more like physical therapy. You have to do the exercises over and over and over again until you rehabilitate whatever part has been injured, right? That's what physical therapy is about. It's not about fixing you. It's about you fix you. The coach is there to hold you accountable, to make sure that you can do some of those things. And I think that's a very common misconception.
I think in the world of sports, at least, there is this sort of sentiment that there's a different type of coach. There's the coach that has played your sport at a high level, and there's one who didn't. And one of the things you talk about is if you're a CEO and you get a coach, like how important is it for that coach to have been a CEO at some point? Like, do they just not get what you do because they never been a CEO? Does that matter? And you talk about that, but that was a question that I know I've come up against when talking with people about this.
Absolutely.
So where do you land on that?
Yeah, that is, you're so right. That is one of the most common things that we hear is somebody says, I want a coach who's walked in my shoes. The reality is most CEOs have walked in their shoes, but that was a unique path at a unique time. And because of that, their whole set of experiences are limited to their experiences. Whereas if you have a coach who's coached many people at that level, they have the diversity of experience to really be able to understand where you are based on a lot of different data points. We do have some great coaches who have been CEOs, but candidly, I think the seasoning comes after they've been coaching for 4 or 5 years. And at that point, they become a bit of a hybrid coach, former CEO. And I suspect the coaching is actually the more important part.
Yeah, it does strike me as sort of the old bias in the world of marketing where I come from was demographics and over relying on demographics and this idea that, this is a male age 30 to 35 when, a male age 30 to 35 who grew up in a totally different place, who has no children versus a father who's 30 to 35 living in that world is totally different in many ways. And so putting them all together just because they happen to be the same age doesn't really make sense. In a lot of cases.
I was also in that advertising world for many years, a couple decades. Yeah. And another way to think about it is the internal marketing department versus the agency, right? The internal marketing department, like an experienced CEO, knows how to do a lot of tactical things. Yeah. But the external agency has the diversity of experience to be able to bring a broader base of knowledge to whatever the problem is, and to think outside the box. And I think for a lot of people, coaching is, the ability to think beyond your limitations is one of the critical things that a coach brings to the relationship.
Well, one of the things that we sort of alluded to here, but it is a specific focus in the early part of your book, is how do you choose the right coach for you? Can you share some of those tips on what you should look for if you're evaluating potential coaches to work with?
Well, I mean, we have a process. So
Is it
by
a
way of
secret, or can
example,
you
it is
tell us
not a
that?
secret. We are proud of our process. I'll tell you about our process. Um, so, a lot of times people just ask friends for coach recommendations. Um, and what they get is they get a list of coaches that are good for their friends, but they're not necessarily good for them. What we do is we listen first just to understand what the person's looking for in a coach, without any bias whatsoever. We don't, we have, over 100 coaches now that we are representing. So we don't, we have no bias in what the answer is. And then we make sure that we present three coaches. And I think anybody looking for a coach shouldn't just assume that the first person they meet who they think is great is going to be the right coach for them. I think we have found that the experience of meeting three different coaches is the beginning of the coaching process. That you start to have, especially if the three coaches, so we curate the coaches, so they're a little bit different from each other. You want coaches that are not the same, because in the process of meeting three coaches that are different, you learn a little bit about yourself and what you're really looking for, not what you think you're looking for.
And what do you mean by different? Like different in terms of like the experience they have that's different in terms of the age that they are? I mean, when you put these three together, how do you think about difference?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. This is, I think, what makes the coaching industry so exciting and interesting at this point in time, because there's really not a lot of regulation or specification around the methods and styles of different coaches. And so it really is about finding the right fit for you at your given point in time. And so there are a number of coaches who have varying levels of experience and differing levels of companies, levels within companies, industries, different tools and methodologies that they'll use. Some are a little bit more tough love, and some are going to be a little bit softer. Some are a little bit more on the advisory and consulting side, and some are just a really good thinking partner and sounding board. And we love to kind of think about this in terms of all of that variation that exists, and really present three unique options for each potential client so that they really understand this is the variety of what's out there.
Mm-hmm.
I want to understand what coaching can bring for me and what are those things that are most important to me at this point in time. We find that makes them feel much more confident and much more informed in being able to determine what is going to be the right fit at that time.
Sometimes it's as simple as someone will say to us, I want to up my leadership skills and my communication skills, but I also have issues of family business. And so we'll present them three different coaches. One whose focus is going to be a little bit more on communication, one a little bit more on leadership, and one on family, because you really can only work on one thing at a time. And in meeting those three people, all of them are going to be good for everything, but each one is going to focus a little bit more on one of the particular areas. And that's a great way to understand what you really are looking for.
Well, I imagine when a team like yours is curating who the coaches that people meet are, you have a certain caliber of person that you're going to meet. Let's say somebody's out there though on their own evaluating someone who could be a coach, and there's lots of people who are out there who kind of say they're a coach, and you talk a little bit about this in the book, that just because someone's a coach doesn't mean they're going to be a good coach. So how do you sort of weed out that person who's like, I'm a coach now, when maybe they've been an executive or something like that, but they don't really, it's sort of the same idea of just because someone's good at something doesn't mean they're going to be a good teacher of that.
Right. This is a tricky question. And again, our recommendation is to try to meet at least three different coaches before making a decision, because you'll start to get a sense for what that sounds like, what good sounds like. The other piece that I think is kind of illuminating is to ask for references or to ask about prior experiences. If you have any testimonials, I think that's a good way to figure out how experienced someone is and if they really have dealt with the unique challenges that you are experiencing today and need a coach's support to work through.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, we always say it's very hard to tell the difference between a great coach and someone who just looks like a great coach. And I think, you're always challenged when you're on that first call. The beginning of that call, the person who you're talking to who might be a good coach is listening to see if you're the right person for them. And then the second half of the call, they're trying to convince you that they're the right coach for you. And I think Jacquelyn is exactly right, is listen for testimonials, listen for the kinds of experiences that are like the experience that you have. to see if they map to what you're looking for, and then get references from real people.
Yeah, and it strikes me that the difference between a coach and a consultant, and people who've worked with consultants versus someone who maybe has or hasn't worked with a coach. And one of the things you talk about in the book is getting started. And when I think about, as a professional who's, entrepreneur running my own companies, when I bring in a consultant with a certain expertise, I give that consultant all the information, and then I expect them to come back to me with what their approach is going to be. So the kickstarting kind of happens from the consultant. Whereas in a coaching dynamic, does it still, like, does the coach come in and say, here are the 3 things you need to work on? And is that the right way to have a coach? Or is it driven by, like, you going to your coach saying, these are the 3 things I want to work on? Or is it depends on the situation? Like, who starts?
Yeah, I think it does depend a little bit on the situation. We kind of divide the world into coach, advisors, and consultants. The people we're working with are not consultants. Our coaches are coaches, sometimes coach advisors. So a coach advisor is going to actually help solve business problems or work out business problems with you, but you're still doing the work, whereas a consultant might do the work for you. Right. But in general, a good coach is going to defer to you to figure out what the things are you want to address. And if you can't figure it out, a good coach is going to guide you to the answers that you already know. Yeah, go ahead.
And another great tool, of course, is 360 assessment, which is a commonly used tool to kick off many coaching engagements, because all of us have blind spots. There are always things that we can't see, that we don't know or aren't aware that we do, some of which may be good and some of which may be counterproductive. And a 360 assessment is just an anonymous aggregation of all of that feedback of all the people that work with, for, and around you. And over the course of that, when you're confronted with 20 people who are now all saying some similar themes and saying you've got a major leadership blind spot in this particular area, well, now suddenly that's been illuminated and you say, maybe I do need to work on my active listening skills.
Yeah. I love how you go active listening. I was good at anger. What did that say?
Yeah, sometimes that does stand out. That does stand out for people. I mean, I know there's a lot of crossover ideas, right? And you think about mentorship, for example, which is typically within a company already. But this growing idea, it's been around for a long time. I guess it's not even new anymore, but reverse mentorship, the idea that someone who's younger could mentor someone who's older versus the typical dynamic of older to younger. Is there an analogous situation in the world of coaching where some people prefer, like, a coach who is younger? Because I know that coaching in general, I mean, there is that sort of eye-rolling moment when anyone who's a little bit older, like me and others, would look at a 22-year-old life coach and sort of think, you're 22. Like, how much do you really know about life at this point, right? Like, so is there that dynamic with, like, younger coaches versus older coaches? Are you seeing any of that, like, where someone's more willing or less willing to be mentored by someone who's younger or coached by someone who's younger than they are?
Well, let's begin with the one misconception: you're not old.
Me specifically, or anyone in general?
You specifically are not old. You're not an old coach. 22 is young, and really, in your example, I think the issue is in 22. It's life coach, and we're not really, for us and the work that we're doing, the level we're doing at, coaching is very much about being a better human being. But that's not the focus of coaching. It's really it's the added benefit of it. 22 is probably a little young, but certainly people in their late 20s, early 30s have enough life experience, and many of them have enough coaching experience to be highly effective coaches. And I think discounting someone because of their age, especially in today's world, where everything is moving so quickly. And sometimes the coaches that have been around a little bit longer might not be as current with some of the more modern trends.
Yeah.
And so if the younger coach works for you, that's the most important thing.
Yeah. And that's part of what I love too about some of our work in curating those coaches, is we can expose them to people who have lived in other countries or different industries, different ages, different genders. I think that it's important to kind of get some sense for what's out there. And open people's eyes to the possibility.
One of the things that I'm actively reading for anytime I look at any book is what are the non-obvious ideas that come from it. I'm curious about your take on what makes the book non-obvious. And I have something that I read that specifically stood out to me as non-obvious, which I'm going to ask you about in a second. But first, I want to get your take on like what makes becoming coachable non-obvious.
Go ahead.
Oh, man. I think, the part of coaching that is obvious to people is I need a good coach. The part that is not obvious is I need to be coachable. It's that other half that of the engagement, as we talked about. A funny thing, and part of how I related to this work was my own experience being a collegiate rower. I was a novice to the team, walked on. And so to say the least, I did not have the skill or experience of many people who had a lot more time in the boat than I had. But I realized very early on that my success was going to be determined by pushing as hard as I could in every practice and consistently hearing the feedback from my coach and getting better. And so really being coachable then was what propelled me to then make ultimately the reserve boat for my college. And I was the only novice rower to do so. And again, the whole reason is because sometimes people with great natural talent and abilities don't go as far as the people who are willing to engage in that process.
Yeah, I love that. I think for me, again, going back to the origin of the book itself, the non-obvious thing was, thinking about how do I find the right coach, and just skipping over the question of how do I be the right coachee? Like, what do I need to do to even be ready to have a coach to get the most out of this? I wonder sometimes if, many people ask themselves that question at all, but it should be the first question.
Do you think the people this is a little bit of a loaded question, but do you think the people who most need to read this book will find their way to it?
That is the funny thing we've been asking ourselves. How many times we have told people about our book and they say, my boss needs to read this.
Wait, ask the question again. I just want to make sure I heard it correctly. Will they find their way to it?
Yeah. Will the people who really need to read the book to become more coachable, will they actually, find their way to this book?
Fingers crossed. People will be leaving it outside their door, on their desk. If they accumulate a big enough stack, maybe they'll realize it.
Yeah.
This book could become like a very soft way to send somebody a message and say, hey, have you ever thought about coaching? Because it may be beneficial.
Yeah.
There you go. You heard it here. You should give it to your boss. That is an excellent way to introduce this idea that perhaps they could be coachable. Yes, exactly.
Right.
One of the ideas I recall reading in the book that struck me as a little bit non-obvious is you write that not all accountability is good. Can you talk a little bit about that? You had a few points there where I think you said like not all action is good too. And you're sort of flipping things around for people and saying that the inclination to act or do things really quickly maybe is something you might want to back away from. So talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And again, I want to just reiterate that the openness framework includes that being open to change, open to feedback, open to taking action, and open to being held accountable. And of course, we also, in each of those chapters, as you said, turn it on its head and say, but not all action, feedback, change, or accountability is good. And specifically with accountability, I do think this is one that challenges people a little bit, but it's just this question of what are you being held accountable to? Be very careful about what it is you hold yourself accountable to, because that really becomes your priority. And some people are all out accountable to their work to perhaps a detriment, that they aren't balanced in their families or their lives or their mental health or their physical health. And those things can start to take a toll over time because of an unrelenting accountability to maybe an employer. And so it's just this opportunity to have a little bit of judgment about what is it that we are really committing ourselves to. And, it's okay to make some forward motion in a direction. And if it's not quite the right direction, we adjust and we refine and we get a little bit better. But I think that's an important question to be asking on an ongoing basis.
Well, you close the book with kind of an interesting chapter which is sort of about flourishing as a leader, but the way you do it is by giving the reader a bird's eye view into kind of a conversation over a period of time. I think it was a day with the three of you. Talk a little bit about the idea for that. Like, was that something where you were kind of thinking, oh, we should give people like an inside look, or this conversation was really great, and so we don't necessarily want to put it into like context of the book. We just want to have the actual dialogue there. Did you have to hit a certain minimum number of pages? Maybe is that kind of, you know, like, what was the thinking behind that?
No, it was. I have to confess, a little magical. So we had written the book, and it was a good book, and we just felt there was something missing, and we couldn't put our fingers on it. And so we decided we would just have a conversation to figure out what it was that was missing from the book. And we called that conversation "To What End?" Like, literally the conversation was, to what end are we writing this book? To what end are people getting coaching? And that conversation turned into chapter 9, which is a conversation about flourishing. Because what we realized was the whole point of coaching and improving people as leaders, and by improving as a leader, we become a better human being. All of that is to the end of increasing human flourishing. I think each of us, and candidly, all the coaches that we work with, are really in it not just to help the one person who's a leader, but it's because we recognize that at the end of the day, leaders are where all the impact stems from. And if we're going to try to create this sort of change and create human and global flourishing, we're going to do it by influencing leaders. And so really that last chapter becomes a conversation, which is really a manifesto. And I have to say, in the audiobook, so we read the audiobook. We had friends reading chapters, et cetera. And we kind of recreate that conversation in the audiobook. I think it's pretty magical.
That's probably my favorite chapter in the entire book. And the part I hope people will stick around for that. You get to hear each of our unique voices as well. Because, that's the thing. It's interesting writing with 3 co-authors. And I think we wrote a very nice unified voice through the rest of the book. But in chapter 9, you start to get to see some of the unique thinking and the unique takes that each of us have. And again, we're 3 different generations and lots of different experiences. And I think it was really a great thing that it came together the way it did.
Yeah, I can see how that last chapter would be a lot of fun to listen to. And I'm personally not a huge audiobook guy, but that chapter I would probably go and listen to because it is all of your voices together, and that's really interesting. So, and it was a perfect ending to the concept of the book too, because that's the promise of being coachable. And if you can become that type of person who is coachable and who realizes all these benefits from being coached, that's the end game. Like, that's what that will be the end that you end up with, which is great. So it's very aspirational that way. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you for an amazing conversation. The book, again, is Becoming Coachable. It is very necessary, perhaps, for you if you're going to go and get a coach. Maybe you want to give it to someone who's a leader in your organization who you think might benefit from some coaching. But either way, it is serving a very valuable purpose, and it's helping you, your leaders, and maybe even your whole company to flourish. So, Scott, Jacquelyn, thank you so much for joining me on the Non-Obvious Book Review.
Thanks, Rohit. It's been a real pleasure talking with you.
So fun. Enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to many more.
Yeah, thank you.